Afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Julie Billiart Schools certainly would like to welcome you to our webinar series about understanding the special education process. And today's webinar is called Making Sense of the Process, Understanding Eligibility. And certainly we love, and we love to welcome you here at Julie Billiart Schools for today's presentation. As we move forward here, I do want to provide a brief introduction in today's speakers. My name is Jason Wojnicz. I'm the principal here at Julie Billiart School Akron. And as we go through today's presentation, I will be providing some great insight in terms of the special education processes, what you should know, and how to move forward with some of your concerns. In addition to me speaking today, I will also introduce my counterpart, Mrs. Gabrielle Redovian.
Hi, I'm Gabrielle Redovian. I'm the assistant principal here at Julie Billiart School, and I am also the director of special education here at JB. So I work with each of the families and students working on their IEPs and their evaluation team reports that happen every 3 years.
Okay, so as we go through today's presentation, you'll certainly have an opportunity to hear both Gabrielle and myself on today's very interesting and important topic for a lot of our kids out there. So let's go ahead and get started and take a brief look into the topics that we're going to be covering today. And certainly there are two acronyms that if you're not familiar, certainly they're acronyms that you will become very familiar with throughout today's presentation. And that's the MFE, the multi-factor evaluation, and the IEP, the Individualized Education Plan. But as we start off today's presentation, we're going to start at the very beginning of the process, understanding where we start. If we have a concern, recognizing that need, where that first initial starting point. Then we'll take a look at that first step into fulfilling those needs within our child's school and education programming and plans. We'll take a look at the MFE, or the multi-factor evaluation, all the components behind that and what's entailed. We'll talk about determining eligibility. What comes next after that MFE? And then finally, we will conclude our presentation talking about the IEP component. Certainly many critical components that lead to children's success within the school programming. And a lot of those components are built right into that IEP. As we go through today's presentation, certainly any questions that you have, we'll be happy to answer. On your screen at the bottom, you'll notice that you'll have a Q&A box, a question and answer box there for you. So as we proceed through today's presentation, certainly feel free to type in any questions that you might have during the presentation or after the presentation. Once Gabrielle and myself conclude today's presentation, we will be digging into those questions for you and answering those. So again, certainly do not hesitate to ask any questions that you might have.
All right, so recognizing a need. This could be done by a parent or the school. And there are 5 areas that a parent or the school might see as a need for the child. They might be struggling academically, whether it's in reading, writing, math, or it could be behaviorally, whether they're struggling to stay focused in a class, or they are struggling with transitions. Those are oftentimes where our younger kids struggle the most when it comes to behaviorally. Socially, the students, maybe they're not interacting with the peers. They're playing, they call it parallel playing, where they're playing next to a peer, but they're not interacting with them. Communication. The 2 main areas in communication are going to be the expressive and the receptive communication. Expressive is the child's ability to verbalize and give an output, where receptive is what is that child taking in? Are they understanding what the directive that the adult is giving them? Are they able to follow 1-2 step directions? And then fine motor is anything doing with writing or being able to have that body control. So if you're seeing an area of weakness for your child or multiple areas of weakness, it's time to take those next steps. And you have to ask the school, have they begun those tier 1 and tier 2 interventions? Now, those tier 1 interventions are for the whole general ed classroom. So whether it's just repeating those directions or giving those verbal visual prompts in the classroom that all students receive. And those tier 2 interventions are going to be providing additional supports, maybe some smaller group instruction or an additional adult in the classroom helping them. So if you feel that your child is still not continuing to make progress or they're falling behind, this is the time that you're going to request an evaluation. Initiating the process. So now you feel like there's a weakness or an area of difficulty. You are going to, in writing, request a multi-factored evaluation to the appropriate department in your school. So that's often the special ed director, or it's called pupil services. It just depends on each school. And you are going to write to them and tell them that you feel that there are weaknesses that are going on with your child. Now, this can also be done with the school. The school might have come to you and said, hey, we see some weaknesses with your child in a specific area. You are then able as a team to say, we're going to collect data and move forward. But if you as the parent feel that there are weaknesses and areas of need, you would write a written request and send it to them with your concerns and any outside evaluations, whether it's outside OT, outside speech, or any evaluations that your child has gone through, maybe with a neurodevelopment or their pediatrician, giving them further diagnosis that you shows weaknesses. Now, the public school then has 30 days to determine whether a multi-factored evaluation will be initiated. So you have to show enough weaknesses for that child in, again, one of those 5 core areas of academic, behavior, social, communication, or fine motor for the public schools to say, yes, we see that their education is being impacted. They're not making the growth they should. So we should start an evaluation process for them. Now, what would happen if the public schools decide to do an evaluation? They call a planning meeting together with a team. Now, that team consists of the parents, the school psychologist, intervention specialists, and related services. Now, the related services could be a physical therapist, an occupational therapist, or the speech and language pathologist. And this together, you would sit down to determine a suspected category of disability. Now, if your child already has been diagnosed possibly with autism, that could be a category that you would discuss at this time with them. But if your child is just showing weaknesses in certain areas and they don't have any formal diagnoses, you would talk with your school psychologist and discuss what category could be a possible category that your child could be diagnosed with for a school MFE. Now, the school has 90 days to complete this evaluation. And on the next slide, you'll see how the process goes and why they are allowed to have 90 days for this evaluation to be completed. Based on what areas of need you determine, will determine which assessments are going to be completed by the school district. And oftentimes those are going to be general intelligence testing to see where they are verbally and non-verbally with an IQ score. Then they will do some academic testing, and that academic testing works with them on reading, writing, and math. And then you will have other areas that they will assess, whether it's behaviorally, or if you determine that speech and language was an area of weakness, you will have the speech pathologist completing assessments, along with possibly your occupational therapist for fine motor and maybe some self-regulation, depending on areas of need for that child. Once all of those tests are done, and those tests are standardized tests, which are done in a one-on-one setting with the child. So either the school psychologist would do those testing, or that speech pathologist does those testings in a one-on-one setting. They also will do some general observations in the classroom to see how they interact with peers or how they follow simple directions, especially if that child is maybe struggling with behaviors of not being able to follow the group plan or struggling with transitions. Then once all of the information and assessments are completed, a meeting will be set up to go over those results. The student is eligible if the team shows there's an area of need that impedes their educational performance, requiring additional instruction and service. So sometimes the student might not qualify for an ETR or an evaluation team report is what it's called. And that is because the student's performance is not impacting their educational need in the classroom. But if a child is struggling maybe with reading and not able to identify letters or identify sounds, that is going to impact their ability to read. So they would, based off of those results, if they show that they is an area of need or a weakness, that child would qualify for something called an evaluation team report. And the student or child would qualify under one of those categories of disability. Now, there are 13 different categories that child could qualify under. And in those categories, oftentimes you will hear them either referred to as like a specific learning disability, other health impairments, autism, multiple disabilities, and that's all based off of the results and the team's decision based off of, again, what your either a medical diagnosis or those school evaluations. And so as a team, you determine whether that child would qualify for an IEP or a 504 based off of those results. Now, a 504 plan is just accommodations for that child. So some kids might need just additional time on testing or one-on-one settings or the test being able to be read to them. And sometimes students might just need to have a nurse with them, depending on what their area of need is. Sometimes parents don't realize that having a 504 could include having a nurse in there for a child. But the IEP is an individualized education plan that we'll be diving into next. And that is where there are specific areas that are impacting their education and their academics that they need to have additional support on to make progress in the classroom.
Okay, so up to this point, we've been talking about the MFE, the multi-factor evaluation, which eventually turns into the ETR, the evaluation team report. Such a critical document because the primary purpose of that document is to really outline the child's current performance and really pinpoint what those strengths and those weaknesses are, because those weaknesses are going to help understand what the deficits are inside the educational setting, which would then lead to the plan, the goals, the process that we're going to be taking with that child to help correct, to help implement new behaviors, more positive behaviors, to increase academic abilities. And so here we are. Now we're done with the ETR document. We've understood that, yes, the child has qualified for special education services, and we are ready to take that next step in creating the IEP document. Now, as you go through this process, it's going to be two separate meetings. You're going to have your ETR meeting. It's going to be the meeting that you're going to run through that ETR document, identify how the student performed on all those assessments for their academic abilities, behavioral abilities, social emotional skill sets, fine motor, speech, and so forth. You have that meeting, you understand what the needs are, you understand that yes, the child qualifies for special education services, you understand that yes, they qualify under this specific category of disability. Now it's time to start preparing ourselves for that IEP. And this is going to be a separate meeting. And so once you conclude the ETR, the school district now has 30 days to put together an IEP document. The IEP document is the document that is the plan. It is to outline the services, the supports, the system that we're going to have in place for this child going forward for the next year. And that's very important to think about the next year. So as we talk about the IEP and go to the different, throughout the different components, be thinking about that. This is not long-term as we think about, 3, 4, 5 years ahead where we want the child to be. We're thinking about short-term. Where do we want the child to be 1 year from now in relations to the deficits that they currently exhibit within the educational school setting? And so as we look at this IEP, we're going to take a look at developing goals and objectives. We're going to be talking about the accommodations as well as the related services that are going to go into this IEP program for your child. All right, so the next 2 slides are going to talk about the main components of the IEP. If I were to go ahead and share an IEP document with you, you're going to see a number of other components. They're all critical as well. But for today's purposes, we are going to be talking about the most important components of that IEP. And that starts with the child's profile. And so as you look at the document, you'll have an opportunity to brief through some general information about the child. You'll have an opportunity to develop a personal goal for your child as well. But then you come to the profile. And the profile is really supposed to be a strong snapshot of the child's current performance inside the classroom setting, really inside the total educational setting. That includes things like specials. That includes things like social opportunities as well, because that social growth, such as during lunchtime or recess time, is a vital part of the education program as well. And so this profile is going to outline those strengths. They're going to outline the weaknesses, and it's going to include testing results as well. You are going to see a section of that IEP profile that resembles the ETR information. All that information that came from that testing within that ETR document, that's going to be inputted in the profile as well, because what that's going to do is that's going to help lead us to the future goals and the objectives that the child is going to be working on. So again, that profile is a strong snapshot of your child. When you get done reading that profile should sound exactly like your child inside and out. And then we get to another very critical component of the IEP. And that's the development of the IEP goals and objectives. And so where do the goals come from? We can't just pull them out of thin air. They have to be deeply connected with your child's deficits that have been outlined in the ETR document. So for an example, if we have an ETR document that talks about communication, and there were speech assessments, communication assessments that were administered, and it was determined that, yes, this child has an articulation deficit. They are struggling with the WH sounds. They are struggling with the TH sounds. That is definitely something that we need to address in the child's IEP. And we know that because the ETR says it. The data demonstrates that there's a weakness, and now it's time to address it in the IEP. And so in the child's IEP, one of the goals is going to be a communication goal. And it's going to be specifically addressing the articulation errors that your child is currently exhibiting. And they're going to be developmentally appropriately. And so for an example, from a developmental standpoint in communication, all of the digraph sounds are not all developmentally appropriate at the age of 5. And so you're thinking in terms of what is appropriate for the next year ahead. What should the child be working on? So the IEP is not going to have 100 different goals. It's going to be very specific to developmentally what is the next step for the child. And those goals are going to be very attainable. The idea is you do want to try to master the goal by the end of a year. So they should be attainable. They should be very relatable to your child's deficits as well as areas of need. And then under that goal, you're going to have a set of objectives. These objectives help break down that goal. What are all the critical components that the child needs to develop and master to be able to be successful with their overall goal? For an example, a child could have a behavioral goal. And that behavioral goal has several components to it that lead to success in the classroom, with socializing with peers and being on task inside the classroom setting. But in terms of the objectives that go with that goal, the teacher is going to be thinking about, what are all the individual steps that are going to lead the student to having success inside the classroom setting with their behaviors. And so, that could start with being able to follow multi-step directions. Certainly one of those objectives could be geared towards that. Another objective could be more geared towards initiating the task. There's a major difference between being able to receive those directives, understand what those multi-step directions are, and then being able to initiate that first step. Those are two vastly different skill sets, and they're going to be two very different objectives within that goal that the child is going to be working on. And so as your child proceeds over the next year, they're going to be working on their goal, on their objectives and their benchmarks that will lead them to their overall goal. So how many goals does a child have on their IEP? That varies greatly from student to student, and that varies greatly based on what the needs are. Now, going back to the ETR, the evaluation process, let's say that the academic assessments came out very strong. The child is excelling or doing grade level work in reading, writing, and math. Because that academic data says or demonstrates that they are having success, they are where they need to be, you would not find a goal around academics on their ETR or on their IEP, because the ETR doesn't demonstrate a deficit in that area. So it's very important to realize that, referring back to that ETR, it is all the deficits that are listed there that are going to lead to the specific goals that are going to be outlined in the child's IEP. And then we get to a couple other very critical components of the IEP. And one of those is the description of specially designed instruction. And so here we have the IEP. Now we have a full set of goals and objectives. We know exactly what the student is going to be working on over the next year. We know what those goals are. We know what the skill sets are going to be that we're very hopeful that the child is going to be able to do 1 year from now. But now in the IEP, we have to understand and identify, well, who was responsible for this? Who was responsible for managing this goal? Who was responsible for collecting data on this goal? And who was responsible for putting together activities, tasks that is going to allow this student to work on these specific goals and objectives? But we also want to talk about, well, not only who is going to be responsible, what is that environment going to look like? What type of setting is the child going to be working in to work on these goals and objectives? These ideas all fall within the specially designed services. And so, for an example, you have an academic goal that focuses on reading fluency. And so this is the first goal of their IEP that's been addressed. And so in the specially designed services of the IEP, it's going to outline goal number 1. And it's going to demonstrate, okay, here we have a goal that focuses on reading fluency. Who is going to be the primary provider? Who's going to be responsible for managing that goal? And so, for an example, that could be the intervention specialist. It could be a general education teacher as well. But for this example, let's say it's going to be the intervention specialist. Okay, so now we know it's the intervention specialist who is responsible. The next question is, where? Where is the child going to be working on this goal? Is it going to be the general education classroom? Is it going to be a resource room? And so in that section, we're now identifying, okay, where are they going to be working on this goal? Is it most appropriate for them to be working on it in a gen ed classroom? Is it most appropriate for them to be working on it in the resource room in more of a one-on-one setting or a small group setting with their intervention specialists? That's a critical component because we know that students are able to succeed better in different environments. Maybe that quieter environment, more one-on-one environment is more appropriate for the child to develop that skill set. We want to make sure the IEP outlines that's how it should be administered. Maybe in a gen ed classroom is a better fit for that child. And so that's certainly a discussion that you want to have with the IEP team. In addition to that, you're going to be talking about the amount of time that this goal should be worked on over the course of the next year. And many times this is broken down by quarters. It's broken down by essentially IEP quarters. You'll find that a common pathway to this is every 9 weeks, how many minutes is this student going to be working on these goals and objectives. And so you're going to go goal by goal by goal, talking about, okay, for the communication goal with the speech therapist, the child's going to be working on their articulation goal 2 times a week for 30 minutes a week. And working through the IEP document with that section. Then you get to the academic goal. Then you talk about, okay, for this math goal, when the child is working on their math fluency, they are going to be working on this goal this many days of the week for this many minutes each day. So, when you think about the specially designed services section of the IEP, again, a very critical component of the IEP, but it's really going to outline the who's going to be working with the child, where they're going to be working, and for how long. Those are 3 critical components that are built into that specially designed services. And then we get to accommodations and modifications. Again, it's on here because it's another very critical component of the IEP. Accommodations and modifications are 2 very different things. Accommodations are things that a child is going to need to have in place to have access to their instruction, to their material, to their programming. And accommodations, for an example, could be extended time. Maybe the child requires extended time for their classwork or for tests. That extended time is going to be important for them. And so we want to make sure extended time is part of the accommodations, because that extended time, that accommodation is going to be in place when they're working on the goals, but that accommodation is also going to be in place across the board inside their classroom settings throughout the course of the day. Some other accommodations could be a calculator. The use of a calculator on a test, the use of a calculator on classwork. Let's say the child is in 5th grade and math fluency continues to be a struggle for them. And they're ready to move on to further operations, more in-depth operations, but we don't want that fluency component to hold them back too much. And so the idea of having a calculator as an accommodation is certainly a viable accommodation for them. Small group instruction is often an important accommodation for students. Being able to have that closer proximity with teachers during their instruction is a vital accommodation for a lot of students. So, as you have this discussion in the IEP team, be thinking about what are those supports that should be around my child that is going to allow them to have better access to the academic instruction, better access to social opportunities, fine motor tasks, and so forth. And then we get to modifications. Modifications is, when you think of the word modify, the definition of it, it is to change. And that's what we're doing. We're making a change to the child's instruction. And so maybe they need a modified curriculum in the area of reading. That is going to allow them to have access to a lower level curriculum, maybe a more structured based curriculum that meets their needs. For an example, if a child has a diagnosis of dyslexia, and so reading is a struggle for them, and that standard reading program that the school is using is just not going to do it. It's not appropriate. It is moving too fast. It is not hitting the critical areas that my child needs for success. Well, then, you know what? We need to modify that curriculum. We need to have the student have access to a curriculum that is better fit for them. So maybe that's the Wilson reading program. And so that's a modification right there. We have now taken the student's instructional curriculum and said, you know what is considered normal is not going to work for my child. My child needs a specialized curriculum that is going to help them establish their reading needs. And so that's where we say, you know what, okay, the Wilson reading program, that's going to be a better fit for them. We're going to go ahead and make a modification to the reading program and allow them to have access to that program. Other modifications can be in relations to when you look across the board at other academic areas and you look at what concepts and skill sets that they should be working on, modifications oftentimes narrow down the number of skill sets. So that way the student is only working on the most important skill sets or the most critical skill sets that are going to take them to the next step, that next level. And then finally, regarding the IEP process, we do want to talk about the IEP team. But in conjunction with the IEP team, what does that look like when you're sitting there at the table and you're around all these individuals? And so let's first talk about who's going to sit around the table. Well, first you have you, the parent, the most critical component of that IEP team. There's nobody that knows the child better than the actual parent. So you, as the parent, play such a vital role in the IEP team. And I encourage you to have that mentality going into the IEP team, into the IEP meeting. It is so easy to get overwhelmed very quickly because you have so many professionals around you. But do think about, going into that meeting and just knowing that you hold such a critical component. You are such an important piece to the puzzle. Because during that meeting, you do want to have a voice, and certainly you have every right to do so. The student can play an important role in the IEP team. Certainly as the student gets older, certainly it may not be appropriate for a first grader to attend an IEP meeting. But as you get into the middle school, as well high school level, it becomes very important for that child to be part of that IEP process, understand what they're going to be working on over the next year, and just receive that information and start to process it. Okay, these are things that are critical to me for my later on success in life. You're going to have a district representative. This could be a principal, an assistant principal, the pupil services director of your school. The intervention specialist is going to play a big role in the IEP process. Certainly if the child has an academic goal or a behavioral goal, oftentimes the intervention specialist is the one managing that goal. And so they're going to be talking a lot during the meeting as well. The general education teacher is a component of the IEP team. Related service providers, your speech pathologists, occupational therapists, physical therapists could all be part of the team as well. Now, if there is a communication goal that is going to be addressed on the IEP, of course the speech pathologist is going to be there. But let's say it's the child's IEP has a communication goal and an academic goal. Well, you're not going to see an occupational therapist there at the meeting because there's not a fine motor skill not a fine motor goal to address. And then here at JB, if your child is attending Julie Billiart School, we have our assistant principal and intervention specialist be present at the meetings as well to assist the family, to assist the parent along in that process. And so as you get into this meeting, it is often led by the district representative or the intervention specialist. Know that the IEP is a public school document. The public school, they need to take control over the process of walking you through all the components of the IEP. So there is going to be an individual that's kind of leading you through the process, and you will go section by section throughout the course of the entire IEP. Now, here's, as I mentioned before, the parent plays such an important role. And again, you look at all the people who are part of the IEP meeting, and it can be very easy for a parent to get overwhelmed very quickly. But as you go into this meeting, be thinking about your child, be thinking about your child's strengths and your child's weaknesses and where you would like to see your child go in terms of their growth. And as you're walking through the goals and the objectives and the accommodations, be thinking about, okay, is this really going to be supportive of my child? Are these goals aligned with where I want to see my child go? And if it's not, I do encourage you to voice that opinion, because it is during that meeting that you're able to have discussions and modify that IEP document to make sure everything is aligned appropriately with your child's needs. So that does put a little bit of a wrap on our components of the IEP processes and the ETR processes. As I mentioned, we did not touch base on all of the IEP components, but we did touch base on the most critical ones. And so for many people attending today, I know you're very new to the process. You may not even have started the initiations of the ETR, but it is important for you to have a clear understanding of what to expect as you move forward. But Gabrielle is going to share a few things with you about some references and resources.
Always feel free. I know that some of you are not familiar with us, but always feel free to reach out to Jason or myself if you ever do have questions related to any of the IEP or ETR questions, even if your child's not attending. We've had families come to open houses, and we've been helping them navigate that process, because we know it can be a scary process or a long process depending on what school district you're in. But the first two resources here are from blogs from the Julie Billiart Schools that our staff has written about the special education process, along with IEPs and ETRs. And then the next three are just some websites that we have found helpful and useful when providing information to families, where they can go for additional resources or information about what are my rights as a parent when it comes to the IEP or ETR. And then the last one is a book that we have that we found is very useful related to IEPs. And then we also have some other webinars coming up. The next one would be advocating for your child when their needs aren't being met. So sometimes you'll feel like maybe they're not getting the services they need in that general education classroom, or how do I really know that their academic goals are being followed? This is where you will get to talk with some of the teachers and staff here at JB, and they can talk you through what you can do to help advocate for your child, who to contact, what resources are available to you. And then oftentimes we'll have families reach out and say, how do I afford services on the Autism and John Peterson Scholarship? So we will have some advocates here to help you work through that and figure out what resources are available for funding.
Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning of today's webinar, there is an opportunity for you to ask questions. You do have a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions, feel free to input those in now. We are going to start addressing some of them. I do have a few questions that have come in. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at that. And between myself and Gabrielle, we can go ahead and give you some responses to the questions that you might have. And so one of the first questions that I see here is, it states that, the last few schools and districts that they worked in, they have kind of stopped using the MFE, the multi-factor evaluation term, and has referred to the process as only the ETR, the evaluation team report. They're just wondering if this terminology is guided by the state or the school. Who makes the decision around how that terminology is used? And so, with MFB and ETR, multi-factor evaluation and the evaluation team report, they are two different pieces of the process. I will tell you that many times a school district or a school will refer to the entire process as just an ETR, because in the end, that's the last piece of the puzzle. That's the last part that you're working on in terms of the evaluation. And so the multi-factor evaluation is the first initial part. It's taking a look at, okay, multi-factored, we have several different areas that we're going to be assessing and evaluating. There's going to be multiple professionals who are part of this process. And so as a parent requests an evaluation, it starts as a multi-factored evaluation. You make your request for a multi-factored evaluation. You're saying that I want to go ahead and take a look at multiple areas here that are a concern to me. And then as the assessments get completed, then you move into the ETR document, the evaluation team report. That is that final concrete piece that you get to walk away with. You get to walk away with the ETR document. And that is where the assessment outcomes are outlined, and it's identified whether or not the child qualifies for special education services. So in short, both terms are still used and they still should be used. It's just actually two different parts of the process.
The next question came in of asking about if their child qualifies under a specific category of disability. Right now, their child has a ETR for speech, and they're seeing that there's additional needs, whether it's learning letters and numbers. So they're seeing that academic deficits are starting to creep in. How can they make sure that their child does not fall behind? One of the biggest areas is going to be, as your child is transitioning from preschool into kindergarten, a ETR oftentimes is completed, or as that child is transitioning into first grade. So make sure you're talking with your school district to find out when your child is going to be eligible for the next ETR. And when you plan that MFE ETR meeting, make sure you're addressing those concerns, that you want those additional academic testing done. Sometimes it's harder with the younger kids because when they do those initial testing in preschool, they're not finding those deficits or those areas of weaknesses in the academics, especially if there is a delay in communication when it comes to their being able to be receptive and expressive in how they're answering questions. And then talk with those intervention specialists that are working with your child. Ask them what they're seeing with your child's progress in academics. You are their biggest advocate here as the parent. Collect any data that you have and make sure you're bringing it to the IEP meeting with you to show where you're seeing delays and deficits. Because if a school district is not doing the proper assessments or collecting that appropriate data, you are there to help, showing where you're feeling that child is struggling with. And if you don't feel like you're getting the information from your intervention specialist, reach out to your special ed director, have a conversation, talk about what your next steps are with them.
Okay, our next question is, will I have a chance to review the proposed IEP before the meeting with the school district? And so, yes, you certainly can. You certainly should. The real question is, does every school district do it? And the answer is no, they don't. That's where the communication piece is very important. You should be able to see the IEP before going into it. It's a lot of information all in one document, and to be able to sit there with a group of people, again, it can be very overwhelming. And so one of the things that I would encourage all family members to do is make that request to the IEP team, to the individuals who are putting the IEP together. Let them know that certainly you do want to see the draft of the IEP before going into the meeting. And certainly talk with them about the timeline of receiving it as well. If your child is attending Julie Billiart School, a little bit of a different process because the information comes directly from us and it goes to the school district. And certainly we have the ability to share, what our document looks like with the family prior to even going to the public school district. And that's certainly something very easy for us to do. But when we look at the public school district, now they have the responsibility of putting together that full IEP document. And, I would just encourage you to make that request because yes, there are some school districts that automatically do it, but not everybody does. And so certainly just take that little additional step and say, hey, certainly would love to see the draft of the IEP prior to the meeting, and then, try to set a specific date to receive that document as well.
The next two questions are related to 504 and IEPs. Now, if your child is in the public school district, you can request an IEP meeting or a 504 meeting at any time with the school district. So you can call a meeting and they can hold numerous meetings throughout the year. Now, if your child is on scholarship, depending on the school district, they may only hold one IEP meeting yearly. And that's when you would work with your provider, like Julie Billiart, to talk about possible modifications and that could be done to the IEP if you feel like your public school district is not able to come and help you and service that child the way that it needs to be. And then the next question related to 504s and IEPs was, is there a difference and what is it? A 504 is just accommodations and modifications. So maybe the child just needs extended time on a test, or some students that might have diabetes might need to make sure they're checking their insulin frequently. So those students would have that 504 plan, those accommodations to be able to leave class or have the ability to have that extended time on a test or assignments or a quiet workspace to do assessments. An IEP is going to talk about specific areas of weakness that child needs to work on. It's impeding their academics in the classroom to be successful. So there are specific goals, whether it's those academic, social, behavioral, communication, fine motor skills that child needs to work on with an intervention specialist or the general education teacher or those extra service providers, whether it's your OT, speech, or PT, to continue to make progress in the classroom. So that would be those main differences between a 504 and IEP.
And the next question is a good one. It's a question that I do get often. And that states, does the state mandate that only one category of disability is chosen during the MFE ETR process? What if someone is equally disabled by a specific learning disability or an emotional concerns such as ADHD, anxiety, autism, etc.? So great question, but this actually is tied with Ohio's revised code. And by law, the child can only be identified by one category in the ETR document. So yes, there certainly could be multiple things that are going on, whether it's ADHD related, autism related, communication related, social emotionally related. Oftentimes many students with special educational needs, it's more than just one area. But in terms of Ohio revised law, only one category of disability can be outlined on the ETR. And so as the multi-factor evaluation team is taking a look at all the assessment outcomes, they're taking a look at all the strengths and weaknesses, they're taking a look at, what is impeding the child's access to the educational program. It is one category that can and only can be selected to understand what is the primary category of disability. Now, there's in the ETR document, there's a box that's underneath where it's outlined of what category is. And oftentimes it should be, demonstrated in writing. The additional components that play a factor in the student's disability. So, if the child's category of disability is autism, but, certainly academic struggles are very apparent as well, it should be outlined that the academic struggles is a critical component of the child's process. And that should be outlined in the IEP as well too. But yes, the answer is only one category can be listed, and that is by law. All right, it looks like we've come to the conclusion of our questions for today. Again, both Gabrielle and myself would like to thank you for being with us for today's webinar. As Gabrielle mentioned, we do have additional webinars that are coming up in the near future. Certainly feel free to attend. But again, thank you very much. I hope you found today's webinar to be beneficial to you. And if any questions going forward, you are always more than welcome to keep in touch with us and ask us your questions directly here at Julie Billiart Schools. Thank you.